Well, the extreme weather comes at a financial cost to Europe. The most recent European heatwave happened back in summer 2022 and caused an estimated $47 billion in economic damage. Parts of Europe saw significant declines in crop yields as the droughts took hold. Olive oil production plunged by over 30%, while output from French vineyards fell 18%. Productivity fell in outdoor industries like construction and transport. German car manufacturing dropped by 20% during the peak of the 2022 heatwave. And tourism, of course, suffered in European countries, in places like Croatia, Greece, Italy and Spain, with losses of between 1 and 3% of GDP. Well, let's talk now to Johann Beckford from the environmental policy think tank Green Alliance. Johann, welcome. Just put this in perspective, if you would. Europe taking this walloping in economic terms back in 2022. What's this year going to be like? The same, bad, worse, okay, better?
Well, the full extent of the economic impacts will be really difficult to tell until we've kind of seen through the rest of the year, and that's really largely because of the length of the heat wave and the extremes in temperature really have a big impact on what the outcome will be. But clearly there is a much longer term trend that the number of high heat days are becoming more frequent and much more severe. As your package just showed, the economic impacts are really widespread, and one that maybe wasn't focused on as much, though, is really around productivity. So where I'm sitting here in the UK, it's estimated that 11 million labour hours were lost across the UK economy in 2022. And in London alone, it's estimated that, over £500 million is lost each year just from heat-related productivity losses, which is a really significant amount. But the impacts are broader as well, as you mentioned. So infrastructure can be shut down, so things like roads and railways can't really cope. And many crop yields as well, obviously, are impacted. And that can feed through to our pockets, really, in the inflation that we see in the products that we're trying to buy. So the impacts are going to be very, very significant.
And are governments taking this seriously in terms of incorporating these climate-related GDP shocks?
Well, I think there's a view that governments would like to be taking this seriously, and they're sort of paying lip service to this, but there's an awful lot more that needs to happen. Essentially, adaptation and resilience have to become national priorities for governments at this stage. So that means it needs to be embedded into our policy decision-making processes across the board. So we need all of our decision-making when it comes to infrastructure, house building, urban planning, agriculture, and of course the financial system as well. They have to be designed with adaptation in mind. At Green Alliance, we're actually calling for an adaptation test when it comes to policy making. So public spending needs to consider adaptation to the future climate risk when it's being made. But at the moment, whilst that happens in theory, we're not actually seeing it played out on the ground. Obviously, companies have their role to play as well. So they can proactively account for climate risk across their assets. They can look at their own processes they have in place where needed, but there really needs to be a sort of government leadership role here, and I think that hasn't come through yet. So what we need to emphasize, though, is that adaptation and resilience planning is really an invest to save agenda. I think governments might be nervous around the kind of amounts of money that are often talked about when it comes to climate risk, but actually if we are able to reduce the productivity shortfall that we were just talking about, or make sure that our infrastructure is resilient to extreme weather, then our economy can continue to function through these kind of events. But if we don't show that kind of leadership at this stage, then those kind of consequences that fall out through our economy, but also our health and social systems, are going to be very severe.
You can forgive politicians, though, and ordinary people for forgetting about this. I mean, there's a number of wars to worry about, cost of living crisis, tariffs we never stop hearing about. It's low on the agenda, isn't it?
Unfortunately, that is the case, but I think ultimately it's going to be rising up that political agenda very, very quickly. We often see in these kind of events, obviously, there being a really big sort of peak in public interest around climate, and politicians often rush to sort of follow that. But what we need to see is a kind of more sustained approach to climate adaptation and resilience planning. And you only have to see some of the impacts that we've talked about. Even if we just rewind a year and some of the devastating floods that we saw in Spain, for example, that more needs to be done. So Again, on sort of specific policies, I'm only best placed to really talk about the UK, but for too long we've sort of not recognised the level of climate threat. The independent advisors that the government here in the UK has suggested that we've actually had a lost decade when it comes to climate adaptation planning, which is, really disappointing to see. And so we need to accelerate that action now. But we can do quite a lot in a short space of time, as there are many, many things that are on the ground. Our infrastructure is being updated. We're looking at building homes. If you embed adaptation and resilience into those processes, then we can really turn the corner.
Johann, good to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming on the programme. Johann Beckford from the environmental policy think tank Green Alliance.